Okay, thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad to be here tonight to talk about the Cincinnati Germans and the Civil War. And I should say, by Cincinnati, I do mean the greater Cincinnati area, both sides of the river, not just the city of Cincinnati. So I got into this, I do a lot of research on his German heritage, and my talk is based on two books that I edited. The first one was Germans in the American Civil War. It was a book published in German in 1911 by Wilhelm Kaufmann. And I edited that for publication in 1999. And the reason was I had seen the PBS film that maybe some of you have seen by Ken Burns. And at the end of it, I said, wait a minute, there was not one word mentioned on Germans, which I thought was a big problem with that program. So I thought, well, maybe he didn't understand German. So I edited a translation. Then, knowing that the 150th anniversary of the Civil War was coming around about 10 years later, I edited and translated a book called The Cincinnati Germans and the Civil War, and I added information on Germans from the tri-state in the area. So that's what, and I do have copies of that book available. Discount price for tonight if you want to get a copy for my wife back there. First we can mention just in general Germans in the Civil War. And by 1860, Germans pretty much had concentrated in what was called the German Belt, settling from the East Coast to New York, Pennsylvania. They settled straight west all the way up and past the Mississippi River, generally avoiding the southern states because of their aversion to slavery. Also, in a slave-based economy, there was no demand for immigrant labor. There were jobs in the north. Also, that's where earlier German immigrants had gone to, in that German Belt area. Of course, there were some pockets in the south, notably in Texas. But if you look at the population, you'll see at that time, the U.S. had 22 million people. There were the German-born 1,185,000, and the Confederate States, only 9 million people, with only 115,000 German-born. Here in our area, population on both sides of the river was 186,000, probably about 40,000 German-born. Then if you take in, of course, the second and third generation, probably at least a third of the population was of German descent in our area, which is interesting to note. And you'll notice from the census figures, you can see, the Confederacy was really outnumbered population-wise. And the reason, I think, when the war broke out, people thought the war wouldn't last long because the North had a much more larger population and industrial base, but the Confederacy not only fought so well, but they had an excellent officer corps, because when the war broke out, most of the officer corps in the U.S. Army followed Robert E. Lee into the Confederacy. Most of the officers were of Southern background. So when the war broke out, there was a big need for soldiers. And right after Lincoln, of course, was elected, states started seceding. Lincoln wisely did nothing. Of course, at that time, the argument was very popular that just as a state could join the Union, they could also leave the Union. So Lincoln did nothing until Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861. Like many, it was thought that the war would be a short duration, so he called for 75,000 troops for a 3-month enlistment. And we'll give you an idea. It was thought the war wouldn't last that long. Of course, they found out soon how long it would last, as I mentioned earlier. The Cincinnati German units, the number of regiments that were raised in Cincinnati, there were 6 infantry regiments. There were 2 militia regiments, which I'll go into as we talk on in my program. In the non-German regiments with Cincinnati German companies, there were several. I guess the number didn't come through there, but there were several. And then there were artillery batteries. So there are quite a few units that were raised here. And of course, I can't talk about each one of these groups within a program like that this evening. It would be impossible to do that, but I will discuss one or two of the units. Now, the value that was placed on these German troops, there were several reasons. One, they had education, many of them, at military academies. Germany was not united until 1871. Up until that point, there were 39 German states, so there were 39 German armies. So many people had studied at a military academy. They had military service in Germany, serving in the army, and in some of these armies there was compulsory service. Then they had military experience in the 1848 revolution. There had been a great revolution in 1848. The idea was to unite all of these 39 German states, and when the revolution failed, many of these 48ers, as they were called, came to America. So they were well experienced because of this kind of a background militarily. Now, why did they join? Well, they were recently arrived immigrants, but many of them, of course, were opposed to slavery. Especially the 48ers who came here after the revolution, they were astonished that this was a slave-based country. Slavery was allowed, and they felt that this should be eliminated. Others were very opposed to secession, the idea that one state could break off from the United States. Of course, and this was because they came from a very decentralized and divided country, 39 states. They couldn't understand that one state would break out and leave the country. Demonstrate patriotism. Well, when they came here in the 1850s in large numbers, there was opposition to the immigrants, opposition to Germans, the 48ers. They were looked at as revolutionaries. There was also opposition to German Catholics. Of course, there was also to the Irish, there was opposition to them. So this was a way for them to show that they were patriotic Americans and good citizens. Obtain citizenship. On the end of their tour of duty, they would not only get their discharge papers, they would get citizenship papers. So this was a quick way to obtain citizenship. So I mentioned there were so many groups and units that we could talk about. Probably the best known German regiment was the 9th Ohio Regiment. So I'll talk a little bit about them. How this came about was the gentleman on the left, his name was Robert McCook. He was a prominent lawyer in Cincinnati, and he said, now that the war is broken out, wouldn't it be a good idea for a German regiment to be formed? His partner was on the right, he was German, Johann Stahlo, and he said, could you talk to people in the German community in Cincinnati about organizing a German regiment? And he talked to Gustav Tafel, who was the president of the Turnverein, or Turner Society. Has anybody heard of the Turners?
Oh, yeah.
It comes from the German verb turnen, means to do gymnastics. So a Turner Society was a gymnastic group, but they were more than that. They were also a social, cultural, and political group. So he called for a mass meeting at the Turner Hall, the Turnverein in the Over the Rhine district. This is where what it looked like was on Walnut Street in the Over the Rhine area. They had a mass meeting there, and they called for the formation of a German regiment. And they got many volunteers to fill the ranks. This is an advertisement for the 9th Ohio Regiment. It was called das Erste Deutsche Regiment. That was the first German regiment formed in the state of Ohio. There would be many formed after that. Because McCook had suggested the idea, he was elected as the commander, the commanding officer, or the colonel of the regiment. There were some good things about him too, that not only did he suggested the idea of having a German regiment, but number one, he spoke English fluently, which the people in the regiment did not. He also was well connected politically in Cincinnati, Columbus, and Washington, D.C. He had, the guy was politically connected, which is important. Also, he was well-to-do, and he offered to outfit the regiment with weapons and uniforms. Of course, when the war broke out, there were no uniforms, there were no weapons. The U.S. Army at that time was only 15,000 strong. So any regiment that was formed had to outfit themselves and get their own weapons, at least till the end of the year when such supplies became available. So they had to have a military adjutant and drill master, even though McCook was in charge of the regiment. So August Willich became the drill master to train the regiment. He came after the 1848 revolution to America and to Cincinnati. He had fought in the revolution. He wanted to get freedom and democracy in a united Germany, and like many of these 48ers, they came to America. His advantage, he had served about 20 years in the Prussian army. He had studied at the Prussian Military Academy in Berlin, and he brought a lot of innovations into the 9th Regiment that then filtered their way into many of the other German regiments as well. Some of these innovations I'll mention and talk a little bit about camp life in the German regiments. Of course, the American bugle goes back to and has its origin in the German-Prussian horn. And so Willich made extensive use of the Prussian horn on the battlefield. They would call out commands on the battlefield. Of course, previous to this and earlier, people would be shouting out, "Let's go there, let's go there." Well, their side would hear it, but so would the enemy. So the Prussian horn would blow specific commands on the field that the other side would not know what they meant. Sounds simple, but it was a great innovation. This regiment too was called, many of them were Turners in the 9th Regiment. They had a lot of class and style. They had their own belt buckle, which said Bahn frei, that would be the belt buckle on the uniforms, and it basically meant, clear the path, get out of the way, here we come. So it'll give you an idea of their spirit. They also had some unique weapons they brought with them. They didn't bring U.S. bayonets. They brought their own Bowie-styled bayonet. The German-American bayonet was much longer and had a curve and was sharp as a razor. It was said to be pretty wicked. So they brought some interesting weapons with them. They also had the Turner knife was based on the Bowie knife. So they brought, again, a lot of these groups had to bring their own weapons initially, and they kept them through the war. They brought a lot of their own rifles. This is an example of what's called a Jaeger, or a hunting rifle. Built, this one is from the 1850s. This would be the kind of rifle that they would use initially when they joined. Also, of course, they had a regimental band in the German regiments. They probably were not singing Yankee Doodle Dandy, they were singing Ach du lieber Augustin, du liegst mir im Herzen. That's our deutsche Musik that they were singing in their groups. They sang German songs. Also, the Star Spangled Banner was translated into German. And this is what the German regiments would sing. And it was so interesting, too. They would have image, there was an image on this. Here would be an image of a German with German folk costume, dress, with a Jaeger rifle, with a black man that they were fighting to free in the Civil War. So that shows their patriotism, that they would sing the Star Spangled Banner. Dietary requirements, well, when they got into the Army, they didn't like that spongy white bread. So they had their own cook rye bread and black bread, Schwarzbrot. They also asked for a dispensation from U.S. military regulation. The German regiments here and across the country, they wanted one additional dietary ingredient. What would that be? Beer. So the German regiments had beer wagons, and they also they could get tickets that they were given. You could get schnapps as well. So they were they were well taken care of.
Listen, went up.
Now, McCook was very popular with the 9th Ohio Regiment because all he had done to outfit and get the regiment organized. And one of their maneuvers, they were attacked by rebel guerrillas, and McCook was killed, and they called it an assassination. And some think it was some band of guerrillas connected with John Hunt Morgan. And maybe Dr. Ramage, I could discuss that with him later if he knows anything about that. But the regiment was really enraged by that killing. They elected Gustav Kemmerling, who was another 48er who had fought in the 1848 Revolution. He became the commander. Well, the regiment was involved in many, many battles. And I can't go through all of them, but one of them does bear mentioning of the battle at Chickamauga, 19 and 20 September 1863. It was called the Bloody Battle of Chickamauga. And the casualties on both sides, Union and Confederate, 34,000. Just think about that. It was a defeat for the Union Army. Chickamauga. And the 9th Ohio, they put half of their regiment, the regiment was about 1,000 people, so they put half of the regiment in the field, 500 people they put in the field, half of them lost in one battle. And this is another thing I documented in my book. There is a very nice monument to the 9th at the National Battlefield at Chickamauga. I think a lot of people don't realize a lot of our regiments from our area have monuments at different battlefields around the country. They're worth taking a look at to see what they look like. Now, some other German units I might mention is the 32nd Indiana Regiment was formed in late 1861. August Willich organized the 9th Ohio Regiment, did such a good job that Indiana said, could you come over to Indiana and organize a German regiment in Indiana? So we organized the 32nd. Two of the companies came from Cincinnati area, had to go over to Indiana. People might ask, well, why did Cincinnati people go over to Indiana? Well, it was because, remember, Lincoln only called for 75,000 troops, so all the regiments got filled up right away. People wanted to join, there was no place for them to join. So two companies had to go over to Indiana and join that regiment. And then Willich organized it. There was an artillery battery that was formed here, organized by Captain Louis Hoffmann. And I was going to ask Mr. Ken Hoffman if he's related to him.
My granddad.
but maybe related. But Louis Hoffmann fought in the 1848 Revolution, used cannons, artillery. Right for the war, he knew how to use cannons. The Americans, they knew nothing. They had no military experience. They couldn't handle cannons. So he was just one example how valuable these German soldiers are. And this is a monument to Hoffmann's battery that's at Vicksburg. Herr Hoffman, you have to go and see that
I wound up in our
sometime. Get your picture taken.
Yeah.
The Western Theater, you know, in our area in the Ohio Valley becomes important because the Eastern Theater, it's a stalemate. Even, you know, you've seen the population statistic, could not defeat the Confederate Army. The two capitals, Richmond and Washington, D.C., only 90 miles apart, the Union Army could never conquer Richmond. That's how good the Confederate Army was and its leadership. So with that stalemate, the war in the West becomes important, and I know Dr. Ramage has written a lot about this, and his books are to be referred to for further details. But one of the first incursions into our Kentucky, our area, was the battle at Rowlett's Station right here. Another battle took place thereafter at Mill Spring, but the Confederacy, of course, wanted to move into Kentucky, which was a slave state, which only had, in the 1860 election, only 1% voted for Lincoln. So they obviously wanted to get Kentucky into the Confederacy, and it would have been a big coup to do that because they'd be close to Cincinnati. At that battle of Rowlett's Station, that is where Willich's regiment, 32nd Indiana, defeated Confederate forces. He had 300 troops facing 1,100 Confederate infantry and defeated them. That was in December 1861, in the first year of the war. It was not a major battle, but it was considered an important Union victory. And by that time, the Union needed to have a victory and show that they were winning a battle, because when the war broke out in April, oh, it's going to be over in 3 months. Well, then by the end of the year, it hadn't come to an end. And the Confederates are trying to move into Kentucky. So it was considered important, and Lincoln was very overjoyed about that. The Battle of Mill Springs, if you remember, that was right next door there. But, you know, was the Confederacy deterred from that? Of course not. The next month, in January, they were again trying to make an incursion into Kentucky. And a battle was fought there between Confederate forces, and this is a battle in which the 9th Ohio Regiment was involved. And this is in a battle in which they made use of a tactic from the Prussian army that Willich had brought into the 9th Ohio Regiment. I mentioned some of their other tactics earlier. A Prussian tactic shown here, the close combat bayonet charge, a frontal attack with bayonets. And that broke through the front line of the Confederate forces and led to the victory. Bayonet charge, that came from the Prussian army. So that helped win that battle. That was a major battle. There would be other incursions too, didn't stop the Confederacy from wanting to combat. Many casualties, again, if you go to Mill Spring, Kentucky, to the battlefield, has anybody been there? You've been there? They have a very nice museum. Dr. Ramage, I'm sure you've been there many, many times. And the battlefield is there to see, and also the grave sites. Gustav Taffel's brother, Hugo Taffel, and many other Germans from our area are buried there. It's really something, if you're interested in the Civil War and the local history, that you should go to see. Then, of course, then comes the siege of Cincinnati. You know, after Rowlett Station and Mill Spring, is the Confederacy, you know, they're not deterred. They make another thrust into Kentucky, and the battle lines look something like that, where 275 is located. And of course you see the pontoon bridge bringing troops across the river, and you see the towers of the rolling bridge, which were not completed by that time. One of the, you know, when we talk about the siege of Cincinnati, they always talk about the squirrel hunters and the Black Brigade. They never talk about the fact that it was the federal troops that were really, the federal troops and the federal artillery that were the steel teeth of the defense of the forces there. One of the regiments there was a German regiment from Cincinnati, the 106th Regiment. It was commanded by Gustav Taffel. And I like that picture with him. You notice the Napoleonic stance. And we do have a gentleman here who has an ancestor in the 106th Regiment.
I think so, yeah.
John Lyman. He had an ancestor who was in that regiment. That was one of the 6 German regiments. When this siege took place, militia regiments were formed. I mentioned militia regiments before. Over the Rhine, there were 2 militia regiments formed. So one of them had Christian Moorline, the beer brewer. We talked about Wiedemann earlier, but Christian Moorline was stationed with a militia regiment, a German militia group, right next to the 106th Regiment. So these militia groups are kind of interesting for me to research. They've been kind of unresearched. Now these squirrel hunters that came to the area after the siege, the danger of that subsided and the Confederate troops withdrew, what did all these thousands of squirrel hunters from all over the state of Ohio basically were? Well, they went over to Cincinnati and they celebrated and hung around there for a while. People got sick and tired of them. They got sick and tired of these guys. And finally, after about a week or two, they finally left town, and people were glad as hell that they got out of town. Because they brought business, but they really got on they were tired of them. Morgan's Raid, which, again, Dr. Ramage has spoken and written much about, when that took place, another indication of the Confederacy moving into our area and how important this was as a diversion too from the Eastern Theater. And that shows the route that he took up through our area, the battle at Buffington Island where the forces were defeated, but how he got up to Salineville up there, and he was finally captured and imprisoned in Columbus. But one thing I wanted to mention here about a German troop connection was the cavalry group that chased down Morgan was commanded by August Kautz, and he led a cavalry brigade that chased down Morgan. Morgan did not surrender to him. That was another officer that he surrendered to, but this was the man who commanded the brigade that chased him down. And I always think he played an important role, because without him and the cavalry, they wouldn't have been chased down. He was born in Baden. He came to America as a child, and what was different about him, he came so young, he wasn't involved with education at a military academy in Germany. He had attended West Point. So he was the only German soldier from our area that had gone to West Point. He had graduated from there. He had even been in the Mexican War. And then after the war, he was on the commission that tried the conspirators of the Lincoln assassination. In the 1870s, he was placed in charge of the military barracks at Newport, Kentucky. So he did remain in the area. Another topic which I've begun to look into, so this far I've been talking about the German-born troops. The 6 German regiments. Well, there were many other American regiments. Well, considering our area, many of these Americans were of German descent. They were American-born Germans. And a good example was Frederick Alms. He was the son of German immigrants and fought in one of the so-called American regiments. But when you look at the names in some of these regiments, they're all German. So they're probably all American-born Germans. After the war, he and his cousin got together, Alms, and started the Alms and Depke department store in Cincinnati. Maybe some of you, have anybody heard of that? Some of them had the misfortune to have been captured and sent to the Andersonville prison camp in Georgia. One of them was Leopold Markabright. He was a member of the 28th Ohio Regiment, a German regiment from our area. He was imprisoned for 13 months up to the end of the war. Later on, he worked for a German newspaper in Cincinnati and became a mayor of Cincinnati in 1908. And it was said that he suffered his whole life from the conditions at the Confederate prison camp. Altogether, 13,000 Union soldiers died at Andersonville. Think about that. The conditions there were just, I don't know how many of you look into that, they were horrible. Most of them died of scurvy, diarrhea, and dysentery. After the war, the camp commander was executed for crimes against humanity. 13,000 died there. So the war was coming to an end by 1864. The Germans in our area campaigned strongly for the re-election of Lincoln. Friedrich Heinrich was a local 48er, and he campaigned vigorously throughout the area for the re-election of Lincoln, who of course was then re-elected. Then, of course, in April 1865, at Appomattox, Lee signed the surrender. One interesting note here we should mention in relation to somebody of German descent was that here in the background, who would that be?
The American.
Born in Ohio of German descent, General George Armstrong Custer, direct descendant of German immigrants at that location. And it was said that that table on which Lee signed was given to Custer. I believe it might be at the Custer Museum in Michigan. I don't know, I haven't looked into that though. Now, after the war, there were a lot of commemorations that took place. German people were proud. They had fought and died for the Union. And in Spring Grove Cemetery, by the end of 1865, this Civil War statue was erected. The director of Spring Grove was a 48er, Adolf Strauch. And so he ordered a monument from the Royal Bavarian Foundry in Munich. And that's the same foundry that created the fountain on Fountain Square. So, and there's a large area at that cemetery for soldiers who served in the Union Army. After the war, too, the veterans founded the Grand Army of the Republic called the GAR. And there was a branch in Hamilton County that many of them joined. And one thing I do highlight in my book was the idea of Memorial Day apparently came from a German soldier from Cincinnati. He sent the idea to the adjutant general of the GAR, and the commander-in-chief of the GAR then recommended that the 5th of May, 1868, be a day to honor those who gave their lives. Now, originally it was called Decoration Day, eventually became known as Memorial Day. And that idea, from what the history of the GAR has to say, that came from a German soldier in Cincinnati. It's something to be proud of. Gustav Tafel, who I've mentioned several times, then became mayor of Cincinnati in 1897 to 1900, and was very much involved in the GAR. And the GAR every couple of years would have what was called a national encampment. That would be a huge gathering of Union veterans. They'd get together, it was like for a national convention and parade. And you have to keep in mind the GAR was the biggest veterans organization in American history. And there was nothing like it. I mean, altogether, you had over 2 million soldiers in the Union Army. You had a lot of veterans. So they had these huge national encampments. He brought one to Cincinnati. That was in 1898, and you get an idea of how huge that was. They're huge parades. Lasted a whole week. They're huge crowds. They built that special bridge over one of the main streets. Just probably the biggest convention or event in the history of Cincinnati to have that many people.
There was 3 times more people there than there was in the city of Cincinnati.
Probably.
That's what they said in the book, so.
Okay, more people, okay. That's an interesting note. Here's another 106th Regiment. Point that out.
One of your ancestors in there.
This was at the 1898 encampment, and here's Toffel, and there are some members of the regiment. So they were, again, so proud for what they had done and served in the Civil War. Maybe one of your ancestors is in the picture, I don't know. You know, and then getting by the turn of the century, the veterans are getting up there in years, and they were proud of what they had done, and they wanted to commemorate their service. The idea came about then a memorial halls were being built around the country. The earliest example was this one that was built in Hamilton, Ohio, in 1906, and it's a beautiful Civil War monument. Has anybody been there to see that?
I've seen that.
In Hamilton? It's not only a monument, but it's a museum inside. Really has a lot of Civil War history to it. A veteran of the Civil War of the 9th Ohio Regiment was the driving force for getting that built in Hamilton, Ohio. Even on the top of it, there is a soldier, you can see that was built or designed by a German sculptor, Rudolf Thiem. This was the man who got that monument museum built, Wilhelm Margadant. He had been in the 9th Ohio Regiment. He was a member of the Turner Society in Hamilton. You know, we had these Turner Societies not only in Cincinnati, Covington, Newport, and Hamilton. They all came together and helped join the 9th Ohio Regiment. And if you ever go there, you'll see they have plaques on the wall that list all of the Germans from Hamilton, Ohio, that were in the 9th Regiment. Margadant was the captain of Company B. What I really like about that museum, they have example of the German swords and the German weapons that they brought into the war with them. These are not American swords, but German swords that they had. We've seen their knives and Bowie knives and bayonets, but they also had swords. Well, the people in the Hamilton County got the idea then they should start a memorial hall, and in 1908 they did construct this building in the Over the Rhine district by Washington Park. Has anybody been there? Yep, okay. There's some interesting items to see there. On the right is a monument, it's a statue listing the names of the members of the Cincinnati Turner Society that perished in the war. Then there's a framed page of a newspaper, a German newspaper, listing all of the casualties from the 9th Ohio Regiment. And then also, which is kind of interesting, there are fragments of the battle flag, the regimental flag of the 9th Ohio Regiment are there. That's all that's left of it. The rest of it was blown to bits on the battlefield. That's it. So it's another, really valuable artifact from the Civil War. These regiments, and I've been kind of following the 9th, I can't really go into detail on all these different groups, although I've discussed them in my book, in case you're interested in looking into them more. But just like the national encampments, all of these different regiments had veterans organizations, each regiment, and they held monthly meetings and big reunions. Well, the 9th Regiment, they had their 50th anniversary in 1911, and this is a picture of the regiment in Washington Park and over the Rhine. And you see the cannon, Civil War cannon, there in the front of the group. That's still in Washington Park. This is the last anniversary that I have been able to track down of the regiment. It was in the 55th anniversary in 1916. The gentleman on the left, he was the youngest veteran. All these guys look at the 90s and 70s. 69, he had been a drummer boy. He got in underage. You know, he was still around. So this was the last big anniversary of the regiment. Now keep in mind that this was 1916. What happened the next year? The U.S. enters the war against Germany, declares war on Germany. There wasn't a time people were praising German-American soldiers, were they? Nobody was praising them for decades, and it only has been to recently, and as I said, even up to the time of Ken Burns' movie, no mention made of German troops. In my mind, that's a big mistake of that film, and it's not unlike a lot of American history. It does not talk about all the things the Germans have done, especially in the Civil War. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.